Hello everyone and welcome to Writing Today. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about the 5 important elements that every good story has. So if you're struggling to create a plot that can capture the reader and you feel that the problem lies in the foundation of your story, these 5 elements will act as a checklist for you so that way you can ensure that your story has everything important to make the reader interested and to enjoy your writing. As always, you can read this post on my website, thepensleuth.com. There's a link to that in the description below. And in case you haven't yet, you can claim your free writing course as well. This is a course that will help you do just that, covering everything that makes a fantasy world so interesting and magical. If you're interested in that course, you can claim it for free in the description below. If you're interested in getting some more hands-on help from a professional writer, I have a writer's workshop which you can join, and you and I can work together to help write your book. There's a link to that in the description as well. So with all that said, let's now get into the video. Now there are many elements that make up a story. A story, depending on its complexity, can have a single character, 100 characters or more. It can have one main plot, it can have several, with many side stories in between. However, when it comes to creating a good plot, there are 5 elements that every story has. And I'm going to be going through those 5 elements now. Starting with the very first one, the protagonist. The first element that most writers start developing is the main character. People often inspire stories, which is why writers can often picture some heroic figure or captivating expression that can inspire an idea that can be developed into a character that can be the center of the story. The protagonist in most fiction is a mostly competent person with a few flaws they need to overcome. The protagonist has a dream, a deep desire, which propels them forward in the story. Some protagonists are out to save someone they love. Some are trying to make good money. Some are simply trying to survive the situation they find themselves in. The role they play is a simple one. They are a vessel for the reader to place themselves. The reader looks through their eyes, understands the emotions, and silently cheers for them when conflict of any kind arises. And the protagonist can come in many forms. You can have a singular protagonist, or you can have various protagonists that you focus on throughout the story, all with different personalities. But you will still be more focused on their role in the plot, but when you have more characters, you also do kind of focus on their interactions between each other. But at the end of the day, the core element is still a protagonist. If your story has a protagonist and you've defined their role well, then well done, because you have the very first element of your story covered. Next, we have the antagonist, or the obstacle in your story. The antagonist can be a person, a creature, an intangible force, a mental or physical barrier, an emotional trauma, you name it. Conflict is the foundation of any good story. The protagonist can only be a protagonist if there is an antagonist. There cannot be day without night, light without shadow. Your protagonist needs something to battle, to overcome. Without some kind of conflict, the story will not gain interest. The most popular form of antagonist is tangible. It could be a terrible knight donned in menacing armor, leading an army of monstrous creatures in a campaign to conquer peaceful lands. It could be an elusive killer who is always one step ahead. It can be a terrible force of evil that needs to be dispelled through the power of friendship, if that's the kind of story you want to tell. On the other side of the spectrum, we have more realistic obstacles. It could be a character that struggles to achieve some task, such as opening a bakery or making it into a prestigious university. There are many things a person can desire that require overcoming some personal obstacle. It could be the protagonist struggles with learning a new field. It could be that they constantly battle a mental disorder. It could be a physical barrier they struggle to overcome, or perhaps they struggle to win the affection of someone they have a crush on. These are the more realistic obstacles because we often experience them throughout our lives. If you can relate to a protagonist more, it makes them a bit more human and investing. So, when you have realistic obstacles such as this, it only makes the character more relatable, makes it easier for the reader to place themselves into the character's shoes. So, if you have your antagonist or your obstacle sorted and planned out, then you have another element of your story sorted. The third element is simply the development of the character's skills, their power, or their personality. While conflict is the foundation of any good story, the only way a protagonist can overcome the conflict is through development. Your character could learn new skills. In that example of the bakery, the protagonist can learn fundamental business skills, baking skills, and people skills. In the example of the protagonist facing a fearsome monster or army, the protagonist can gain more strength, be it through themselves or by creating an army of their own. If a protagonist is trying to gain the affection of their crush, perhaps they learn to accept they can't achieve their goal by forcing a fake personality, or resorting to cheap tactics in order to win the crush's affection. The protagonist must then develop their personality and become a better version of themselves. Usually this development can span most of the story. The protagonist will encounter many smaller conflicts, growing smarter, stronger, or wiser. Perhaps they gain good friends who help them on their journey. As it is the bulk of the story, you will tell the story of these various events and demonstrate their effects in future chapters. And I really want to emphasize this element's importance. It is this development that should be considered whenever you create conflict. We learn lessons every day. Throughout our lives, we're always learning something new. We learned not to touch fire by naively bringing our hand close to a candle's flame. And that is a simple lesson that will stick with us for the rest of our lives. Of course, some lessons take time to learn. A person might need to fail at something several times before they understand where they are at fault. And hopefully they'll learn their lesson before their next failure costs them greatly. So if you know who your characters are in the beginning and who they will become in the end, and you understand what changes they need to make in order to reach that point, then you have development sorted for your story. A final conflict is when the culmination of all the protagonist's efforts is put to the final test. Usually, this final conflict is expected, being established early in the story, or at least expected to happen, even though not said aloud. The final conflict is when the protagonist faces their greatest antagonist, or their work is measured, or they overcome their final obstacle. In novels with a physical antagonist, this is when the protagonist captures or defeats the antagonist. It could be in a medieval fight with swords and shields, a gunfight, bare hands, or perhaps the protagonist outsmarts the antagonist, trapping them. Either way, the antagonist has been defeated, and nobody has to fear them again. In more realistic stories, this is when the efforts of the protagonist are finally tested. They overcome an important hurdle when it comes to their social anxiety, they run a successful restaurant, they gain the affection of their crush. You get the idea. An interesting fact is that most writers will often think about this final conflict and its resolution before they think of any other scenes. This is because when this conflict has been resolved, it's the story being at an emotional high that inspires them to write the story itself. Now, this final conflict is very important to the reader as well. The whole story leads up to this final conflict and they're very eager to see the result of it. And if this goes unanswered, it could be a very displeasing book. It's not to say that it will be a badly written story, but it will feel more like an incomplete one without this resolution. The protagonist could win, they could lose, but that would be an answer to a question that was proposed at the very start of the story. So if you have a final conflict in mind and its outcome planned out, then you have another important element sorted. Many writers like to end their novels the moment the conflict ends. The moment the bad guy stops breathing, the moment they win a trophy, the moment the main plot has come to an end. It's a legitimate method for ending a novel because it leaves a lot of expected scenes to transpire in the reader's imagination. It also serves to keep the word count down to fit a specific market. It gives the writer more time to focus on the main plot rather than what comes after. Of course, a writer can choose to talk about what comes after, explaining where the characters go from there, or skipping forward in time to establish where the characters are now. It depends on how conclusive the writer wants the story's ending to be. Usually this is done when the characters are still in a situation where it needs to be explained how they got out of it. These kind of endings also work because it gives the writer an opportunity to tie off loose ends for the reader's interest, and perhaps to hint at a possible sequel. If a writer intends to write a series, it is often recommended that they do consider the future novel before they finish the first novel. That way they can properly connect these novels structurally and logically. And if the writer does plan and think ahead well enough, they can hint at the plot at the very end of their first novel, or the previous novel, depending on how far in the series they are. Taking the time to consider the ending of your story, whether it be a final statement or several chapters, is a very important part of writing a good story. If you have your ending in mind, then you have the final element of your story sorted. And now it's time for my final thoughts on this subject. I can only speak from experience, from my own writing, and from my conversations and work with my students. And if there's anything I learned from both of these, it's that it's very easy to mess up a story if you don't have the basics mastered. You can have so many characters, side stories, and interesting scenes in mind, but if it lacks this basic structure, then it's like a person without a skeleton. They can't stand up on their own 2 feet. Now, hopefully another point that you take from this video is that you don't need so many elements to write a great story. You don't need to have hundreds of characters, you don't need locations all over the world, you don't need twists and turns, you simply need to have a story of a protagonist overcoming an obstacle. That is what interests people. They want to see people struggle, succeed, or fail in an interesting way. So, if you can cover just that much, you can write a simplified story that will still be well liked amongst your readers. Of course, this is only my interpretation of the elements that make up a good plot. I'd very much like to hear what elements you believe are very important to a story. What do you think about when you are creating an interesting plot? Let me know in the comments below. If you're interested in checking out more of my work, you can find it on thepensleuth.com. That's also where you can claim your free course or join the writer's workshop if you're interested. There are links to that in the description below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, as it helps me out a lot. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, good day, good night, and happy writing.